Several years ago, I helped out on a research study related to attentional styles in marathon runners, which was led by a friend and former grad school roommate. And a few months after the study was published, I received a Christmas card from my co-author and his wife, who had written the letter. In her family update, she mentioned that Matt had published research on what marathon runners think about when they're running. Now, my first reaction was, well, it's really more about association and dissociation. And my second thought was, wait, that's exactly what the paper was about. We were ultimately summarizing what marathon runners think about when they're running the 26.2 mile race, especially what they think about toward the end after hitting what marathon runners call the wall around mile 20. But looking back, we may have been guilty of making things a little more complex than they needed to be. And I made the same mistake with my master's thesis. In plain English, my master's thesis was about how an elevated heart rate influences a tennis player's ability to hit serves accurately. But instead of speaking in plain English, like a normal human being, I used academic Klingon to fit in with the literature in this area of sports psychology. Consequently, the study disappeared into the digital abyss, never to be heard from again. By the time I began work on my doctoral dissertation, I wised up a bit. And I set out to conduct a study that would answer a research question that would be of interest to people other than me. And I sought to keep it as simple as possible. And I succeeded to some degree. The study was so simple that some of the interviews of my youngest participants were conducted in a sandbox. And one mom asked if my school project was for high school or for college. But my simple little study has been featured in major newspapers in the US and Canada as well. And when I Googled my name a few years ago when I was applying for a job, I noticed that the study had been read into the parliamentary records in Australia and New Zealand. This paper, called Kids Speak, Child Preferences for Parent Behavior at Youth Sport Events, which was published in the Research Quarterly for Exercise and Sport, was by far the most read paper of the few that I've published. And it was also the most simple, which is what I was striving for in order to emulate sports psychology researchers that I admired, like Tara Scanlon at UCLA. Calling someone a simpleton is usually an insult, but simplicity is not something to be ashamed of. Simplicity is something to strive for. The most influential studies in the history of psychology are some of the most simple. They have elegant designs. Some of these designs are incredibly clever, but they are never very complex. Let's consider the foundational studies that introduced classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning theory. Each form of learning was discovered, or more accurately, demonstrated, with a simple research design. After Ivan Pavlov noticed that his dogs began to associate the sound of his approach with a salivary response in anticipation of being fed, he developed a simple study to demonstrate the sort of learning that takes place when a neutral or conditioned stimulus, like the sound of a bell, is repeatedly paired with a reward or unconditioned stimulus, such as food. He rang a bell before feeding the dogs until salivation became a conditioned response to the conditioned stimulus, the sound of the bell. Then he measured increases in salivation after the bell was rung, thereby demonstrating that the dogs had learned to associate the sound of the bell with being fed. Then Pavlov built upon his findings by changing a single variable, the time interval between the ringing of the bell and the presentation of the food. And he found that dogs learned faster when the food was presented more quickly following the bell. In discovering operant conditioning, B.F. Skinner created the operant conditioning chamber, now better known as the Skinner box, to demonstrate one way in which the consequences of behavior can shape later behavior. The small chamber created an isolated environment with 4 walls and a lever or button for a rat or pigeon to push or peck, respectively. And with his invention of the cumulative recorder, he was able to record how many times a rat pressed a lever or a pigeon pecked a button after they were reinforced with a reward, usually something like sugar water. And like Pavlov, Skinner continued his line of research by changing a variable, such as the reinforcement schedule, and measuring the behavior of his rats and birds, then changing a different variable to answer a slightly different research question. And through this process, he took the route of the tortoise, progressing slowly but surely toward an understanding of operant or instrumental conditioning. And although, to my knowledge, B.F. Skinner never worked with turtles or rabbits, Aesop's fable of the tortoise and the hare provides important wisdom for new researchers. To put in the amount of work that's necessary to complete a senior project, a master's thesis, or a doctoral dissertation, a student needs to be excited about their topic. And that's a good thing. Enthusiasm fuels hard work. But sometimes the excitement borders on dysfunctional ambition, which leads some students to design overly elaborate research studies with far too many variables. And because they are looking for far too many things, they end up finding nothing. With more variables, the student may hope to explain more variance in the outcome variable, or use sexier statistical methods. And yes, in academia, statistical methods can be sexy. But with too many variables in the picture, more often than not, the results just get messy and meaningless. Early in our educational lives, quantity is sometimes the primary objective, which usually means doing more than is comfortable. Writing a 5-page book report in junior high or a 10-page term paper in high school can seem almost insurmountable at the time. So students change font sizes and play with margins to embellish the length of their paper, trying to reach the minimum. Some bring this habit with them to college. But the challenge is different when the student gets older, especially once they start to create and disseminate their own research. Instead of quantity, the new goal is brevity, trying to say what they need to say as succinctly as possible. Most scholarly journals require manuscripts to be no more than 30 double-spaced pages, including tables, figures, references, and so on. And believe it or not, getting under this page limit is often very difficult. And the revision process often involves looking for ways to simplify the message without omitting important details. In the early 1960s, Albert Bandura had a profoundly important message: that classical and operant conditioning can only account for some forms of learning. And he developed what is now called social learning theory, which was based on a profoundly simple idea that people sometimes learn just by observing. So in 1961, he created a series of simple experiments, now known as the Bobo doll experiments, to demonstrate this simple idea. He recruited 72 boys and girls from the Stanford University nursery school. Some of the children observed an adult playing nicely with a blow-up clown, while others observed a man or woman hitting and kicking and beating the Bobo doll. And the assignment of children to each condition was counterbalanced to ensure that an equal number of boys and girls observed male and female Confederates playing with the doll nicely or aggressively. And a third of the children were part of a control condition in which they didn't observe an adult playing with a doll at all. Not surprisingly, Bandura found that children who observed the aggressive model were more likely to act aggressively when they had a chance to play with the doll, hitting and kicking the Bobo doll in ways similar to those they had observed earlier, more aggressively than children who had observed an adult playing less aggressively, playing nicely with the doll. The children in the aggressive model condition were also more likely to speak aggressively while playing with the doll, just as the adults who modeled these behaviors had, saying bam and pow like they were in an episode of Batman circa 1966. Bandura's simple study provided insight into a simple truth that can be summarized with the old adage that says, monkey see, monkey do. Or as Yogi Berra quipped, you can learn a lot by observing. The simple elegance of the Bobo doll studies may be why they remain so influential. They're easy to understand, and they got at an important truth. So what can we learn from Pavlov, Skinner, and Bandura? Especially when conducting translational research, try to keep the research design as simple as possible to get results that are as clear as possible to provide information that ultimately will be as actionable as possible. And try not to worry about figuring out the entire world in a single study. No matter how many times you read Aesop's Fables, the tortoise always wins. Strive for simplicity in creating a research design that will yield simple results, because the key findings of many of the most influential studies could be summarized in common English in a single sentence in a Christmas card. Simple is not easy, and not just in a chaotic world of Twitter feeds. Simplicity has been the enemy of complexity since humans created civilizations. And that is why many of the major world religions, Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, Christianity, admonish believers to strive for simplicity, to focus on what is most important and to let go of the rest. But this is very difficult, especially for scholars. Why? Well, many of the great thinkers from each faith often point to pride as one reason and fear as another. Once we as researchers get past the sort of adolescent pride that motivates us to try and appear smarter than those who don't share our particular expertise, we realize that the goal is not to impress people with big words or confuse them with esoteric jargon. The goal is to make important discoveries as simple as possible without losing something in the process, and distill ideas to make them easier, not harder to understand. The great minds of the Eastern and Western intellectual traditions are invariably those people who are able to state important truths as simple phrases. Cogito ergo sum. I thirst. E = mc². Be quick, but don't hurry.